Brace yourself. Better pass up anytime now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in a sad, sad world. Walk around the light a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So slip back in your hole.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good to be with you today. The Iliad is over, but our story is not over. We're in the 10th year of the Trojan War, and there are still more stories to tell in this epic saga of the Achaeans versus the Trojans. So today we're going to do two things. First, before we pick up the story, we're going to look at what can actually be known about what, if anything, really happened for 10 years on the plains of Troy. Is the Trojan War a true story? If so, how do we know and how much do we know? And then we'll move on, we'll pick up where we left off and start telling the rest of the story. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to Unbreakable Iliad Aftermath Part 1. So Troy is, hopefully this comes as no surprise, Troy is a real place. This is an aerial view of the actual city of Troy. It sits on a mountain in Turkey. Turkey is a modern term. The Trojans would not be familiar with that term. But it sits on a mountain. Mountain might be an exaggeration, a hill known as Hisarlik, which I think, I shouldn't say things I only think, but I think means potbelly hill. Hisarlik in Turkey. The city has many names. They themselves would not have called the city Troy. In their own language, their language was the Luwian language. Everybody speaks Luwian, right? That'll be put to the test here a little later today. In their own language, the name of the city was Wilusa. When the Greeks talked about Wilusa, as we often do, we take words, even when we don't translate a word from a foreign language, we often adapt it so that it's easier for us to pronounce. The Luwian Wilusa in the Greek language became Ilios, also sometimes Ilion, so such that the Iliad means about Ilios, about the city of Ilios. Troy, where's that name come from? The wider region where the city sits is known as the Troad. So by calling it the city of Troy, we're really calling it the main city of a wider area. Ultimately, Troy and Ilios are used interchangeably in the Iliad of the place that the natives would have called Wilusa. Wilusa was excavated beginning in the 1800s by the really interesting, we've talked about him a little bit at the beginning, really interesting but not and talented, but also kind of weird and unreliable archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann did incredible work for preserving the history of humankind. In his day, everyone would have assumed that the entire Iliad was fiction, that none of this was real, none of it took place. He said, well, hang on a minute. I'm just going to pick up my Iliad, said Schliemann, and I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to go to the places where the Iliad says this stuff is, and I'm going to dig. And he did. He found Troy, as well as Mycenae. I should admit to you, by the way, I consistently and somewhat intentionally mispronounce Mycenae. To be authentic, I should be calling it Mycenae, but I'm just not going to be doing that. So, one of the problems with Schliemann, though, is he liked attention. So he genuinely finds Troy, and he genuinely finds tons of artifacts, and then he announces to the world very specific things. Like, so he'll find jewelry, gold and jewelry, and he'll say, I have found the jewels of Helen, with very little very little evidence to support that. When he
Good morning, Coyotes. This is a reminder that to do uniform checks. Also,
They wouldn't do that to Heinrich Schliemann.
will be going all throughout this week, next week, and the following week until Valentine's Day. During second period in room 104. For any questions, please email Ms. Thomas or go to room 104 for any inquiries. Middle school winter dance, which includes
I guess technically it's home and I should stop
DJ,
complaining.
is January 25th, 6th, and 7th, period. FDUS Multicultural Night Foreign Language Club is February 2nd from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. at the gym.
When he dug through and excavated Mycenae, he found a massive palace complex, yes, and he found crowns and art and jewelry, and he says, I found the palace of Agamemnon. Again, that's quite a leap. But what he did give us is irreplaceable. We just simply couldn't do without the work of Heinrich Schliemann. Our Troy, the city of Troy of the Iliad, is the 7th settlement on that site. So there are 6 cities older than our Troy, further down below the ground than our Troy, and it was built and destroyed or abandoned several times after the Troy of the Iliad. Our time period is around 1250 BC. Archaeological evidence does show that the city of Troy was destroyed roughly around 1250 BC. What's not clear from the archaeology alone is what caused the destruction. The archaeology supports Troy having been destroyed in a war with the Mycenaean Greeks, but the archaeology is not that specific. It would support just as well Troy falling to an earthquake or something along those lines. The Mycenaean Greeks themselves, obviously Mycenaean Greece is real, and all of the major Achaean cities mentioned in the Iliad are indeed cities that were prominent centers during the 13th century BC. Even those, there are some which were no longer major settlements at the time of Homer, that Homer claims are major cities, and archaeology then supports that, yes, 500 years before Homer, these places were indeed major centers. And they would have been ruled by kings, just as the Iliad says, although we need to shift our understanding of what the term king here means. When we hear kings, we're probably thinking of the strong central leadership and absolute monarchs of the late Middle Ages in Europe or of fantasy TV and movies. A Mycenaean king, an Achaean king, would fall somewhere between. He would have more power than we normally associate with the word chief, but less power than we normally associate with the word king. Nevertheless, a union of Greek warlords that we call kings, representing all of these cities like Homer portrays, is certainly something that was possible. Possible and probable are not the same thing, and possible and certain are far from the same thing. Challenge is when doing history, especially when we're doing history that goes back this far, we're no longer dealing in questions of certainty the way we are when we do math. It is all but certain that 2 plus 2 equals 4 no matter what. Okay? If 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, that would mean that reality bears absolutely no relationship to our experience, and we'd be unable to know anything. So we can say with near certainty that 2 and 2 is 4. We never have that kind of certainty in history. History is all about probability. Yes, when we go back 3,500 years, or 3,200 years, as we are with the Trojan War, but even when we go back much more recently, it It is not certain that George Washington was the President of the United States. It is probable. In the case of George Washington being President of the United States, there is so much evidence available to us that the probability is so high that we're justified in speaking as if we are certain. But there's still the gap between the probability and the certainty. We go back 3,200 years, that gap is much wider. So I mean, you'll get a little bit of my opinion and my judgment based on greater Homer scholars than myself. By the way, okay, so I am technically a Homer scholar. Why? Well, I study Homer, I teach Homer, I collect a paycheck for that, and my students are awarded college credit for that. So I am a Homer scholar. However, if there were to be a gathering of Homer scholars, I probably wouldn't even have a seat at the kiddie table. Like, I'd be pouring the coffee. Or like the big shot Homer scholars I'd be the one they're giving a swirly to in the bathroom. But you're stuck with me, so we'll do the best we can as we explore some of this. Forgive my choppiness. I'm experimenting with a different way to record. So here is a 3,000 plus year old, 3,300 year old Hittite tablet. The Hittites were the major power in the region of Troy. It's not clear that the Hittites ever had direct control over Troy, but they were the main political entity. And this tablet happens to mention Troy by the name of Wilusa. We have clear evidence of the existence of the city of Wilusa or Troy at the time, but what we don't have is any written history of Troy or of its destruction or even of its normal everyday life in better times. We have no narrative that comes to us other than Homer, or at least no narrative that comes to us prior to Homer, with one tiny exception I'll break to you a little later in the program. Which means one of our big challenges is when you read Homer, Homer is coming to us 500 years after the fact. And yet Homer is the oldest version of the story that we have. Every other version of the story that we have is not only after Homer but dependent on Homer. If I leave the room and I come back and Kenza, there's just a pile of ashes in the chair where Kenza used to sit. And I say, what happens? And Amanda Blanco says, well, Kenza exploded. And Sandra says, well, I was talking to Amanda Blanco and she said Kenza exploded. Do I have two sources for what happened to Kenza? No. I have one independent source, because the second source is dependent. It comes from the first. And so it's Homer all the way down when we're looking for a narrative of what might have actually happened. It's almost certain that the story was being told for 500 years before Homer. But we don't have any of that except for what is preserved by my main man, Homer, who would have really looked like this. You're so funny, Mr. Childers. You make class so interesting with your creative slides. Sorry, who would have probably really looked like this. I love Homer as much as anybody else, but there are some real challenges to accepting Homer's account as straightforward history. What do you think some of those challenges might be? What should give us reason to hesitate before we say, Homer said it, I believe it, that settles it? Chelsea Grime, what do you think? Come here. What are some challenges to accepting Homer's account as history?
We weren't there, so we don't have, actual evidence of it.
Well, sure. We weren't there, so we certainly don't have first-hand evidence. We don't. But I wasn't there when George Washington was president, and yet I accept the evidence of people who were. What makes accepting Homer's word a little more complicated? Dolly, come here. my life. This is my life.
Sorry. The fact that you have intervention from gods throughout the story a lot, that means that the story is reliant on the Greek religion.
Mm-hmm. Which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but unless we're prepared to accept the claim that evidence and reason suggests that all the gods of Greece are real and operating causal factors in what happens in history, that's a problem. Here's my list. Here's my list of a few reasons why. Love Homer, but you can't just take him as straightforward history. Even his sources are goddesses. He is overtly claiming to be inspired by the Muses, and that when he sings, the Muses are singing through him. What Dolly hit on, the account is full of supernatural occurrences. It's not my claim that necessarily supernatural occurrences are excluded from any possibility of being real, but to claim that something supernatural has occurred, to claim that at one point Zeus makes it rain blood in the Iliad. At another point, at several points, warriors are supercharged with super strength and able to lift boulders that no man could lift, weak as men are today. Well, so yeah, Maury says, so we're supposed to believe that the gods gave them all this power? Well, while we're in the middle of the story, we're supposed to believe this, but do we actually believe this? Achilles fights a river. Achilles' head catches on fire like Ghost Rider. Those are two of the badassest moments in all of Western literature. I could not do without them. I would not want to be part of a world where those stories didn't exist, but they lend me to question whether those things actually took place. They're pretty extraordinary claims. And, Nick, shout it loud and proud. Extraordinary claims demand...
Extraordinary evidence.
He was very proud. He wasn't particularly loud. Extraordinary evidence. Homer doesn't have much of any understanding of what Trojan culture is actually like. What are the Trojans like? They're Greeks, only they're kind of wusses and they like fancy things. They're forgive the gendered language here, but from the perspective of the Greeks, they're girlier Greeks. Right? They even worship the Greek gods. Now, he's caught something from centuries earlier that turns out to be true. When he presents Apollo as the patron god of Troy, it turns out almost certainly Apollo is not a naturally Greek god. Apollo is a god imported from West Asia. Apollo would have been worshipped at places like Troy long before the Greeks. And he composes 500 years after the fact, just decades after the reinvention of writing. That doesn't mean he made it all up. But if I asked you to tell me the complete story of your time in 6th grade, well, how successful do you think you could be in reconstructing your own experience of 6th grade? Jean's give me one of these. Just give me one of these. All right? For everyone but me, if I can count, and I think you can, yeah. For everyone but me, 6th grade was less than 10 years ago. For me, 6th grade was less than 40 years ago, and far less than 500 years ago.
Sorry for an interruption. Julian Link, please report to the office, please. Julian Link, please report to the office.
She's going to pick up the other phone. She's going to say it 6 more times. She's the one who does that. But she's going to wait till I start talking again. And it was certainly a lot less than 500 years ago. I'm fairly confident that almost all of your 6th grade teachers are still alive. I bet a little more than half of mine are. I only know of one who's dead. I run the math. I haven't kept track of my junior high teachers because I hated junior high. I loved high school. I keep track of them. As the time passes, the counts become less and less reliable. Inevitably, unless the storyteller is citing mountains and mountains of evidence, which is not the way Homer operates because he is a poet, not a historian. Best argument for there being a historical core to the story. So best argument is made. I'm holding a book that has no pictures or words on the cover, so I don't know why I'm holding it up right now, and I'm not even on the screen of the video. But the book is called Trojan Homer by Joachim Leitatz, and I've given you an electronic copy of this somewhere on Schoology. The best arguments for there being a real Trojan War, Mycenaean Greeks against the people of Wilusa, comes from an analysis of Homer's language. It's a linguistic argument. And I'm not going to go into great detail. I'm just going to give you a short summary, the best version of the strongest argument. You recall that Homer, like almost all epic Greek poetry, is written in a poetic style set up known as dactylic hexameter. All right? It's down in a deep, dark well, so I got to do it over again because the stammering screws up the syllables. Down in a deep, dark well sat a brown cow munching a beanstalk. And he's very strict. He almost never breaks the pattern. When he does break the pattern, Leitatz shows in detail, I'm just asking you to take my word for it until you read Leitatz. Leitatz shows in detail that almost every time he breaks the pattern, it's because the pronunciation of words had changed. And when the line is written not as it would have been spoken in Homer's day, but as it would have been spoken 500 years earlier, it fits the pattern. Only times Homer breaks the pattern are when the pronunciation of words has changed, which shows pretty conclusively that there are whole sections of Homer that are centuries older than Homer. That the story has indeed been passed down from generation to generation to generation, though growing as it is passed down. What you're looking at here is a mural from what is called, don't get your hopes up, it's called by Heinrich Schliemann, the Palace of Nestor in Pylos. It is a real Mycenaean palace. It is in Pylos where Nestor is portrayed as king in the Iliad. And why it's so important is it shows even before, this is probably a few decades older than the Trojan War, it shows already there is a tradition of people like Homer, the bard, the singer, the storyteller, had already had a central place in Greek culture 500 years before Homer, already had a central place in Greek culture at the time of the Trojan War, which means if the Trojan War actually happened in some fashion, they would have started singing about it right away. Carolyn Alexander observes, it is strange that this is the story that comes down to us. Because as wonderful as the story is, as wonderful as the execution of the story is, the plot is so stupid. Right? This is a ridiculous war. The greatest war story ever told commemorates a war that established no boundaries, won no territory, furthered no cause. What are they fighting over in this war? A Dyson? Helen! One cheating wife. You know, if Vladimir Putin came to the United States and First Lady Jill Biden were to run off with him, oh, we'd all be talking about it. We'd all be laughing about it. President Biden would be screaming about it behind closed doors. What do you think are the odds that the United States of America would go to war with Russia if Vladimir Putin ran off with Joe Biden's wife. Mariam says pretty high, but she's just joking, is she not? People today, are we willing to start a war that would destroy our civilization over something like that? Well, Mariam would, so ladies and gentlemen, never elect Mariam.
Isn't Russia currently involved in Ukraine?
It is. So why is this story? Why did this story get remembered? Here, what I'm about to tell you is, I was going to say my own theory. It doesn't even rise to that level. It's my own hypothesis. Hopefully, it's strong enough to count as a hypothesis. So, about a generation after the Trojan War, you have, we've talked about a couple of times, the Bronze Age collapse, where every vibrant, powerful civilization of that part of the world, except for Egypt, collapsed. We don't know all the details. We don't know how in all of the particulars. When Mycenaean Greece collapses, it's the beginning of the Greek Dark Age. You'll recall that in the Dark Ages of Greece, like they forgot how to read and write completely. Completely lost the skill. So thoroughly that when civilization started recovering and it became time to become literate again as a people, they had to reinvent a brand new alphabet because they had utterly lost the ability to read and write. My, not even a theory, my hypothesis is that whatever actually happened in the Trojan War was the last great military victory of Mycenaean civilization, right before it collapsed. And so it was remembered and became legendary because there was nothing to come. There was nothing that came after it. And as the story was told, it was told by people living in people who were poorer, people who were less educated, people who had access to so many fewer resources than their ancestors had, and who then looked around at the creations of their ancestors and thought, these men must have walked with gods to build all these things. So that's my suspicion. Suspicion is probably even a better term than hypothesis, but that's my suspicion of why the story has survived. There's a major gap in the record, though. What we would expect to see is 500 years worth of artwork depicting Trojan War scenes before Homer, and there ain't. You want to be the most important person who's ever lived, in my opinion? Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration. Study hard, stay in school, become an archaeologist and an art historian, and go to Greece and find me the art that represents the Trojan War that is older than Homer. Because the earliest piece of art that obviously represents the Trojan War is a little bit later than Homer. We don't have what we expect to have. So the evidence is still all linguistic. I will show you that piece of art when it becomes safe to do so. Right now it contains a spoiler for our story. But this is, that we do have Mycenaean art of the time period. This is from shortly, maybe a generation after the Trojan War, depicting Mycenaean soldiers, depicting them in their boar tusk armor. Now this is complex, so I need you to follow me for a second here. We call this boar tusk armor because it's made out of the tusks of boars. Sandra, come here. Teachers are expected not only to educate, but to conduct what we call checks for understanding, to make sure that everyone gets what we're talking about. Sandra, pop quiz. Why do we call this boar tusk armor?
Because it was made from boars.
What part of boars?
The tusk.
The tusks, yes. Sandra's got it. Sandra's got it. Thank you, Sandra. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the oldest of an entire cycle of epic poems that once told the full story of the Trojan War. Unfortunately, all of them are lost, except for the Iliad and the Odyssey. We have only the tiniest fragments of the other poems of the epic cycle. And the fragments are so tiny that we're rarely able to find anything meaningful in those fragments. So if we're going to tell the rest of the story, where are we getting that from? What are our sources for the rest of the Trojan War story? What you're looking at here on the screen are the key sources that we have for the Trojan War. Nothing is more important than the Iliad and the Odyssey, and everything we have depends on the Iliad and the Odyssey. I want to highlight in particular two of these. The Chrestomathy of Proclus. Proclus is a librarian. Now, he lives maybe as much as 1,200 years after Homer. But he's a librarian at a private library that has all of the poems of the epic cycle. And he wrote a catalog. These are all the books in our collection, and he wrote one-paragraph summaries of what the books were about. Now try to imagine a one-paragraph summary of the Iliad. It would give you a far from perfect understanding of the Iliad, would it not? It would make our time together much shorter. That's what we have of the epic cycle. Proclus one-paragraph summaries. Another really important source is Quintus Smyrnaeus, his Post-Homerica. And this is the source we'll use more than any of the others. Now, it's a very late source, around 350 AD. But what it does, what Quintus Smyrnaeus does, is he gathers all the other sources that existed, including many we don't have anymore, but he did have. He had access to the whole epic cycle. He had access to tons of stuff that's lost. And he's the only one who tries to put it all in a single story. The Post-Homerica is intended to be Iliad Part 2. It picks up where the Iliad leaves off, and it tells the rest of the story. As we cover the rest of the story, we will sample from many of these things on the list. But by far, we'll hear more from Smyrnaeus than we will from anyone else. Breaking news, ladies and gentlemen. Breaking news. In around 1985 or 1986, an incredibly valuable, unexpected source was found. An account, a poetic account from the time or shortly after the time of the Trojan War, written in the Luwian language, the language of the people of Troy. It begins like this. Aha, tata, alati, awienta, wilusati. In the language of the Trojans. Now, we all speak Luwian, right? Sandra doesn't speak Luwian, so I'll go ahead and translate it. When they came from steep Wilusa, these words are 500 years older than Homer, from the time or shortly after the time of Trojan War, so we're in for a real treat. When they came from steep Wilusa, and it cuts off. That's all that's been preserved. That single line has come to be known as the Trojan Iliad. It is amazing, but it tells us frustratingly little. I will sneak it in at some point in the next few lessons. It will be included in what we cover. Now, what about the characters? Which of the people we've been talking about are real? Well, almost certainly not Helen. Helen seems to have begun her life thousands of years before the Trojan War as a goddess, as a divine figure associated with the sun, as a Proto-Indo-European goddess who then, as her stories got told, she became humanized. There's a lot more evidence that her brothers, Castor and Pollux, began their lives as gods and eventually became humanized, and that their story goes back so far. It goes back to the parent population that from which both the Greeks and India descended, because the divine twins that the Greeks call Castor and Pollux are still worshipped in India as part of their pantheon also. So it's unlikely that Helen was real. The two that are most certainly real are Paris and Priam. The historical figure behind Paris is named Alexandru. You'll notice that in the Iliad, Paris has two names. They alternate between Paris and Alexander. Alexandru lived in the early to mid 13th century BC, which means the real Paris is a little older than our time period. He was either the generation before the Trojan War is set, or a very old man at the time of the Trojan War instead of a young man. And he was a king of Wilusa, not a prince. His name Alexandru is a Louisianized version of the Greek name Alexander, and it is the first appearance of the name Alexander that we have in the written records. Doesn't mean he's the first person ever to be called that. It's interesting that it is a Greek name, and yet its first appearance is on a non-Greek person. He's mentioned in treaties with two Hittite kings that still survive. A couple interesting things in these treaties. One is one of the treaties just happens to mention, hey, Alexandru, remember, my grandpa and your grandpa were friends, so we have to team up. Where have we heard that before? In the Iliad, when Diomedes, my main man, Lord of the War Cry, and Glaucon are about to fight, and they stop and tell each other's family history, and they're like, okay, our grandfathers are friends, and they shake hands. Here we have independent evidence. I wish I could say independent evidence of Diomedes, my main man, Lord of the War Cry. But we have independent evidence of that being part of their culture, that our grandpas were friends, or so are we. The treaty also implies that there was something fishy, something peculiar about how Alexandru ended up on the throne. And the treaty is issued in the name of three gods, including Apollo, who is called storm god of the army. This is not a Greek treaty. This is a West Asian treaty. More evidence for Homer's contention that Apollo is an important god of Troy. How about Daddy, King Priam? Well, the figure behind King Priam, the historical figure, is named Piyamaradu. He lives in the 13th century BC. He lives at the right time period, but he's younger than Alexandru, and he is not a king, at least as far as we know. He's mentioned in the letters of three Hittite kings over a period of 35 years. And at some point, he's presented not as at war with the Achaeans, but as allied to the great king of the Ahiawa, which would have been the Trojan and Hittite name for the Achaeans. And the great king of the Ahiawa would be the king of Mycenae, whoever the actual figure was that we call Agamemnon, at some point is allied with the actual Priam. Does that contradict the story? Does that mean they could not have gone to war? No. In fact, it suggests that perhaps the reason they went to war is there was some sort of betrayal here, some sort of breach of this alliance. The Hittite kings refer to him as a troublemaker, an adventurer, a freebooter, a mercenary. He may be, so here's a little country called Arzawa. It may be that he is the grandson of a king of Arzawa who the Hittites overthrew, which may be how he was able to, because otherwise he's just a pirate, all right? Otherwise he's just a gangster. And yet he marries his daughter off to an Achaean king, the king of Miletus. It doesn't make sense for a pirate to do that, but there's some linguistic evidence centered around his name that suggests he may be the grandson of a deposed king. So he might have had a claim to a nearby throne, and who knows, maybe eventually sat on one. The Hittite kings complain that in the course of his wandering, freebooting, mercenarying, adventuring, troublemaking, all told, he killed or captured 7,000 of his own people, or people from his part of the world, and either killed them, sold them off into slavery, possibly sold them off into slavery to the Achaeans. So here comes a mind-blowing theory. Now, I've seen enough. No one has ever asked me. No Homer scholars are asking me what I think. I see enough evidence to say, yes, absolutely, this guy is Priam. There's more to it than that. In the 500 years between the life of Pia-Maradu and the writing of the Iliad, so it seems his story is being told over and over and over again. And in some places where it's being told, they've kept his name, and they have evolved the story to make him not just a pirate, but a king, and specifically the king of Troy. In other places where they tell his story, they've not preserved his name. They preserved his military power, his I'm going to do my own thing, I'm a freebooter, I'm an adventurer, and they've preserved his betrayal of his own people, his killing of his own people. According to a scholar of classics at the University of Athens, Pia-Maradu is not just Priam, he's also Achilles. That behind this is Konstantinos Kopianos, professor of history and archaeology at the National University of Athens. A really reputable place to be a professor of classics. Can I prove this? No, I'll give you his article. You can follow his reasoning. But it is a mind-blowing theory that behind the two different characters on opposite sides in the Iliad lies a single historical figure. All right. So that's the background, and it turns out that that's all we're going to have time for today. So we will carry on the story, the narrative.
Walk around a lot a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So sit back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me.